Revenge is usually loud. It's emotional. It comes with interviews, clapbacks, and public shots fired. But sometimes the most devastating kind of revenge is quiet. No press conference, no explanation, just one decision that flips the entire power structure on its head. That's exactly what happened with Caitlin Clark. Because this story isn't really about basketball. It's about control. It's about who decides whose voice matters. And it's about what happens when a player grows so big that the gatekeepers no longer get to decide her future. For years, one man sat at the center of women's basketball like a throne. Geno, the architect of dynasties, the ultimate talent validator. If you mattered, he called. If he didn't, your ceiling had already been decided for you. That's how the system worked, until it didn't. Caitlin Clark didn't break into the sport through his program. She didn't wear UConn colors. She didn't benefit from the machine that turned stars into legends. Instead, she built something outside of it. And that's what made this situation so uncomfortable. Because when Clark exploded into the biggest name women's basketball has ever seen, the system wasn't ready. The same voices that once ignored her suddenly had opinions. The same people who passed on her suddenly had warnings. And the same coach who never made the call suddenly had a seven-figure offer on the table. On the surface, it looked simple. 8 weeks of basketball, over $1 million, a chance to headline a new league backed by powerful names. To most players, that's an automatic yes. But this offer wasn't about opportunity. It was about reclaiming influence. That's why her answer mattered so much. Caitlin Clark didn't argue. She didn't explain. She didn't defend herself. She didn't even acknowledge the history. She just said no. And in doing so, she exposed something much bigger than a failed recruitment or a missed business deal. She exposed a system that believed players needed permission to be great. She exposed an old guard that underestimated what happens when fans choose for themselves. And she proved that power in women's basketball no longer flows from the top down. It flows from the court, from the fans, from the player who never needed validation in the first place. And once you understand that, everything that happened next makes perfect sense. Before the sold-out arenas, before the logo threes, before Caitlin Clark became a walking television event, there was just a kid with a dream. And that dream had a very specific name attached to it. UConn, Geno, the gold standard, the place where legends were stamped into history. Clark has said it herself. Growing up, she wanted that call. Not because she needed it, but because what it represented mattered. If Geno called, it meant you were seen. It meant you were validated. For decades, that phone call was the difference between being considered elite and being treated as good enough somewhere else. But the call never came. No long conversation, no home visit, no serious pursuit, not even a courtesy check-in. For a coach famous for spotting generational talent, the silence was loud. And it wasn't accidental. UConn already had Paige Buchers locked in, and Geno later explained that he didn't want two ball-dominant guards. On paper, that excuse sounded logical, until he added the part that changed everything. He suggested that if Caitlin Clark really wanted UConn, she should have called him. Think about that for a second. A Hall of Fame coach sitting at the center of the sport, placing the burden on a teenage player to chase him. The message underneath was clear. You're not a priority. If you want this badly enough, prove it. That moment mattered more than people realize. Not because Clark felt entitled, but because it revealed how the system worked. Some players were hunted, others were expected to beg, and Clark took note. She didn't complain. She didn't campaign. She didn't try to force her way into a space that clearly didn't want her. Instead, she made a decision that changed everything. She chose Iowa. No built-in dynasty, no automatic national spotlight, no safety net, just a program willing to hand her the keys and let her be herself. To some, it looked like a step down. To Clark, it was freedom. That was the moment the power quietly shifted. Because when someone shows you they don't believe in you, You have two options: chase their approval, or build something so big that their approval becomes irrelevant. Caitlin Clark chose the second option, and from that point on, every bucket carried memory, every record carried context, and every packed arena whispered the same message. You should have called. Iowa was never supposed to become the center of the basketball universe. It didn't come with championship banners hanging from the rafters or a legacy that guaranteed national respect. There was no machine in place to turn players into icons. That's exactly why it mattered. From the moment Caitlin Clark stepped on the floor in Iowa City, it was clear this wasn't a compromise. It was a declaration. She wasn't fitting into someone else's system. She was the system. At UConn, she would have been another star in a long line of stars. At Iowa, she became the gravity. Every possession bent toward her. Every scouting report revolved around stopping her. Every road game turned hostile because people weren't just watching Iowa, they were watching Caitlin Clark. And that pressure did something important. It revealed who she actually was. Those logo threes weren't reckless shots. They were confidence weaponized. The no-look passes, the deep pull-ups, the late-game bombs, they weren't highlights chasing attention. They were proof of control. She wasn't playing to survive in a system. She was bending the game to her will. Attendance exploded. Small gyms turned into sellouts overnight. Television numbers climbed week after week, not because Iowa suddenly became a blue blood, but because Clark made them must-watch. People who had never followed women's basketball before were tuning in just to see what she'd do next. That doesn't happen by accident. And while the numbers climbed, the silence from the old gatekeepers stayed the same. Geno didn't reflect. He didn't acknowledge the miss. Instead, subtle comments started to surface. Dismissive tones, shrugs dressed up as analysis. The message was always the same: this is fun, but let's not overreact. Just a kid messing around, just hype. But hype doesn't fill arenas like that. Hype doesn't pull casual fans into a sport they've never followed. Hype doesn't rewrite how media talks about women's basketball. What Clark was building at Iowa was bigger than wins. It was cultural. She wasn't borrowing prestige anymore. She was creating it. And every game made the original decision look worse. Because now the question was, why didn't Caitlin go to UConn? It was, how did UConn let Caitlin go? And that question didn't just linger. It followed Geno. Every viral clip, every broken record, every sold-out building quietly reminded him of the same thing. This wasn't supposed to happen without him. But it did. And that realization was only the beginning of the discomfort. As Caitlin Clark's profile exploded, something subtle but telling began to happen. The conversation around her shifted, not from critics on the outside, but from voices who were supposed to represent the highest level of the sport. Instead of acknowledgement, there was resistance. Instead of respect, there was reframing. This is where dismissal quietly turned into denial. Rather than saying, "We missed," the narrative became, "Let's slow this down." Rather than embracing the moment, it was treated like a temporary wave that would eventually crash back to reality. And that posture revealed more than any outright criticism ever could. Geno's comments didn't come as direct attacks at first. They were subtle, polite, wrapped in experience. He talked about how the game really works, about how college stardom doesn't always translate, about how fans don't understand context. On the surface, it sounded reasonable, veteran wisdom, measured perspective. But beneath that tone sat something else. Every time Clark's name came up, it was immediately tethered to someone else. Another system, another player, another legacy. Her rise couldn't stand on its own. It always had to be explained, diluted, or compared, not celebrated, managed. That's how denial works. You don't confront the reality. You reframe it until it feels smaller. The irony was brutal. While Clark was being described as hype, she was doing the very thing hype can't do: sustain momentum. Week after week, the attention didn't fade, it grew. New audiences showed up, ratings spiked, conversations expanded beyond basketball circles. She wasn't just part of the sport anymore, she was driving it. And that kind of influence threatens people who built their identity around being the center. Because if Caitlin Clark could do all of this without the traditional pipeline, without the blessing of the dynasty, without fitting the mold, then what did that say about the system itself? That's when the tone sharpened. Comments became less about basketball and more about behavior, about expectations, about fans being unrealistic, about pressure, about how this league humbles people. It was no longer analysis, it was positioning. The message was clear: enjoy it now, but don't forget who really understands the game. Yet the more those warnings surfaced, the weaker they sounded. Because Clark wasn't shrinking under pressure, she was thriving in it. The moments got bigger and she got sharper. Late games, tight margins, national stages, she didn't blink. And that's when denial stopped working. Because you can dismiss potential. You can question projections. But you can't argue with outcomes. And Caitlin Clark was stacking outcomes faster than anyone could reframe them, which left only one option for those who refused to adapt: change the narrative or try to control it. And that's where things started to get personal. When the game itself stopped offering openings for criticism, the focus quietly shifted. If Caitlin Clark couldn't be contained on the court, then the attention moved off it. And that's when the fans entered the crosshairs. This was the turning point. Instead of questioning her skill, the conversation began questioning the people who believed in her. The excitement around Clark was no longer framed as organic growth. It was labeled exaggerated, misguided, even harmful. The message changed from "she'll need time" to "her supporters don't understand basketball." That wasn't accidental. By attacking the fan base, the narrative could still be controlled without directly confronting her success. It was a way to invalidate the movement while pretending to protect the game. Dress it up as concern, call it perspective. But the subtext was obvious: this attention doesn't belong. And that's what made it resonate so deeply. Because for the first time in a long time, women's basketball wasn't being carried by tradition. It was being carried by connection. New fans weren't showing up because they were told to. They were showing up because they wanted to. They saw something different, something electric, something worth following. Instead of celebrating that shift, it was framed as a problem. Words like delusional entered the conversation. Enthusiasm was painted as ignorance. Hope was treated like disrespect. The idea that a rookie could make an immediate impact was mocked, not debated, but dismissed outright. And in doing so, the line was crossed. This wasn't about managing expectations anymore. This was about gatekeeping, about deciding who was allowed to dream and who was, about reinforcing an old hierarchy in a moment when it was clearly slipping. What made it worse was the timing. Women's basketball was experiencing a surge it had never seen before. Ratings climbing, arenas filling, merchandise selling, young fans discovering the game for the first time. Momentum was finally real and fragile. And instead of nurturing it, someone with enormous influence chose to push back. Not against the league, not against the system, but against the people fueling its growth. That move exposed the real fear. Because if fans were right, if Caitlin Clark really was that impactful, then the power dynamic had already changed. Authority was no longer coming from the top down. It was coming from the court up. And once fans realize their belief is validated, they don't ask permission anymore. They follow results. And Clark was giving them plenty, which meant the old narrative had one final test left. Reality. Reality arrived fast, and it arrived loud. Once the season tipped off, the debate stopped being theoretical. The questions, the doubt, The warnings about adjustment periods all collided with what was happening in real time. Caitlin Clark didn't ease into the league. She didn't hide behind veteran systems or wait for permission to assert herself. She played the same way she always had, confident, aggressive, and completely unbothered by the noise surrounding her. And that's when everything unraveled. The performances stacked up quickly, big shots in big moments, crowds showing up early just to watch warm-ups, road games suddenly feeling like home games because her jersey was everywhere. This wasn't hype surviving off nostalgia. It was momentum being fed by proof. What made it uncomfortable for critics wasn't just that she was good. It was that the predictions people laughed at started lining up with reality. The same fans who were dismissed as clueless were watching their expectations materialize on the scoreboard. The same optimism that was mocked as disrespectful was suddenly backed by numbers, minutes, and impact. That shift changed the tone overnight. Awards conversations followed, recognition followed, and when the season wrapped, the results landed exactly where they had been projected. Not exaggerated, not inflated, accurate. The moment that was supposed to expose overconfidence instead exposed how out of touch the criticism had been. And here, where the reckoning truly hit. No rebuttal came. There was no apology tour, no acknowledgement that the warnings had missed the mark. Instead, silence settled in. The arguments that once dominated interviews and podcasts quietly disappeared because there was nothing left to argue. You can't debate production. You can't spin efficiency. You can't downplay impact when it's measurable. The fans noticed. The people who were labeled a problem had been right all along. And that realization mattered just as much as Clark's stat lines, because it validated a new audience, one that was told they didn't belong, didn't understand, and shouldn't be taken seriously. They were taken seriously now. And Clark never said a word. No quotes. No victory laps. No "I told you so." She let the results speak, night after night, game after game. That restraint made it hit harder. Because the story stopped being about proving someone wrong. It became about outgrowing the conversation entirely. The attention shifted away from who doubted her and toward what she was building. By the time the season ended, the debate had flipped. The question was no longer whether the hype was justified. It was why so many people fought it in the first place. And that answer was coming next. Once the results were undeniable, the conversation changed in a way no one expected. The criticism didn't disappear because minds were changed. It disappeared because leverage was gone. The old talking points no longer worked. You can debate potential. You can question readiness. You can speculate about ceilings. But once a player proves they belong at the highest level, all of that collapses. That's when the power dynamic finally flipped. For years, the structure of women's basketball revolved around gatekeepers. Coaches, executives, legacy voices, people who decided which players were elevated and which ones waited their turn. Validation flowed from the top down. You earned respect by fitting into the system, not by challenging it. Caitlin Clark broke that model without ever announcing she was doing it. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't align herself with the old power centers. She didn't need endorsement from the people who once decided what mattered. Instead, she built something parallel to them, and then bigger than them. The numbers told the story first. Ticket demand, viewership spikes, merch sales, media coverage following her instead of the other way around. The league wasn't introducing her to fans. Fans were showing up because of her. That's when the discomfort set in. Because once attention shifts, authority weakens. And once authority weakens, control starts slipping. The same voices that once dictated the narrative were suddenly reacting to it. Instead of shaping the conversation, they were chasing it. That's a dangerous place for anyone used to being the center. You could see it in the way commentary softened, then sharpened, then softened again. praise wrapped in qualifiers, compliments followed by caveats, recognition paired with reminders of how hard it really is. It wasn't analysis anymore, it was adjustment. And Clark didn't adjust at all. She kept playing. She kept delivering. She kept drawing eyes. That's what made this moment different from every breakout before her. She wasn't just succeeding inside the system. She was changing where the system pointed. By the time discussions about alternative leagues, new ventures, and innovative opportunities started circulating, the reality was already clear. Any new project needed her more than she needed it. Any new platform needed her audience. Any new idea needed her credibility. That's not influence, that's control. And control doesn't come from titles or legacy. It comes from attention, trust, and momentum. Clark had all three, which meant the final test wasn't going to happen on the court. It was going to happen often. And when that moment arrived, her answer would say more than every highlight combined. The moment the offer surfaced, everything snapped into focus. This wasn't just another off-season opportunity or a creative business move. This was a reveal, a quiet admission of who actually held the leverage now. When reports surfaced about a 7-figure offer tied to a short 8-week commitment, it sounded shocking on the surface. But the money wasn't the headline. The timing was. Years earlier, the phone never rang. No urgency, no pursuit, no acknowledgement that Caitlin Clark might be worth building around. Now suddenly the checkbook was open, and not just open wide. That's how you know desperation has entered the room. Because truly powerful figures don't chase. They don't overcorrect. They don't rush to attach themselves to something they once dismissed. They let gravity work. This wasn't gravity. This was scrambling. The offer wasn't about opportunity. It was about reclamation. If Clark accepted, the narrative could be rewritten. Her rise could be reframed as an extension of an existing power structure instead of proof that it had been bypassed. Her popularity could be folded back into a familiar story, one where legacy still mattered more than momentum. But Clark saw the play immediately. She didn't see respect. She didn't see belief. She saw timing. And timing tells the truth every time. This wasn't an invitation made when belief was cheap. It was made after proof was overwhelming, after fans had already chosen, after the market had already spoken, after her presence alone could legitimize an entire venture. That's not faith, that's dependency. And dependency flips the power dynamic completely. Clark didn't need the platform. She already had one. She didn't need the exposure. She was the exposure. She didn't need validation from a system that had already revealed its limits. So when the decision came, it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't strategic posturing. It was clean. No. That single word did more damage than any public feud ever could, because it removed the illusion that the old structure still mattered. It confirmed what many suspected but few wanted to admit. The future wasn't waiting for permission anymore. By turning it down, Clark didn't just protect her own trajectory. She exposed the imbalance. She showed that the value had shifted permanently, from institutions to individuals, from gatekeepers to creators, from approval to influence. And once that shift becomes visible, it can't be reversed. That's why this moment lingered. That's why it stung. That's why it mattered. Because it wasn't rejection. It was confirmation that the era had already changed. What happened here goes far beyond one player turning down one offer. This was the moment an entire system quietly revealed its cracks. For decades, women's basketball ran on a familiar formula. Power flowed downward. Coaches, institutions, and legacy programs decided who mattered when they mattered and how far they could go. Players were expected to fit into that structure, wait their turn, and accept whatever opportunity was placed in front of them. Caitlin Clark didn't rage against that system. She simply outgrew it. That's what made this moment so uncomfortable for the old guard. The rejection wasn't loud, but it was final. It showed that influence no longer lives exclusively in boardrooms or on sideline clipboards. It lives with the audience, with the fans, with the player who can move numbers, fill arenas, and change the conversation without needing permission. The system didn't collapse overnight, but it blinked. And blinking is how you lose control. The irony is that this wasn't personal in the way critics want it to be. Clark didn't set out to embarrass anyone. She didn't launch a counter-narrative or weaponize the moment. She just chose alignment over access. And that choice forced everyone watching to confront an uncomfortable truth. The structures that once dictated success are no longer guaranteed relevance. That's the part people keep missing. This wasn't about money. It wasn't about ego. It wasn't about revenge. It was about leverage. When a player can say no to 7 figures and nothing about her career slows down, that tells you exactly where power sits now. When a league needs one athlete more than that athlete needs the league, the hierarchy has already flipped. The system wasn't rejected because it was weak. It was rejected because it was late. Too late. And that's why this moment will be remembered long after debates fade and headlines move on. Not as drama, not as controversy, but as a quiet line in the sand. A signal that women's basketball has entered a phase where stars are no longer shaped by institutions. They shape them. Caitlin Clark didn't dismantle the system. She stepped outside it. And once players realize that's possible, the system can never go back to operating the same way again. That's not just a turning point. That's a reset.